The signal should not have existed. Valith Sonkari pressed her auditory membranes flat against her skull and stared at the waveform cascading across her translation matrix. 31 years she had spent decoding the linguistic structures of 93 known species across the Compact of Aligned Civilisations, and not once not with the click-pulse dialects of the Morvathi, not with the electromagnetic song of the deep void Ovari, not even with the maddening chemical gradient syntax of the Vreth collective, had she encountered a transmission pattern that refused to resolve into meaning. Every species produced language through predictable channels. Vibration through atmospheric medium, electromagnetic pulse modulation, chemical gradient exchange, bioluminescent syntax. The known categories were finite, mapped, catalogued, and filed in the Compact's central linguistic archive under her own signature. This signal fit none of them. "Play it again," she said, and her junior analyst, Torek, cycled the recording from the beginning. The bridge of the survey vessel Calith Voss hummed with the steady drone of its ion drives as the signal filled the compartment for the 11th time. It was structured, Valith was certain of that much. The intervals between bursts were too regular to be natural phenomena, the frequency modulations too deliberate to be stellar noise. But the layering was wrong. Where every known species encoded its language on a single primary channel with at most 1 or 2 supplementary channels, this signal carried at least 4 simultaneous channels of information compressed into a single carrier wave. Each channel operated on a different encoding principle. One was tonal, one was rhythmic, one appeared to be mathematical, the fourth she could not identify at all. "Origin point?" she asked. Torek pulled the navigational data onto the main display. Bearing 217, galactic relative, distance approximately 400 light-years from the compact border, deep in the Voreth exclusion, the dead zone. Valith's secondary eyelids flickered. The Voreth exclusion was called dead for a reason. 14 survey missions had entered that corridor in the last 3 centuries, each one equipped with the Compact's most sensitive passive scanning arrays. All 14 had returned with the same verdict: nothing, no signals, no energy signatures, no evidence of habitation, transit, or resource extraction. The corridor's official classification listed it as sterile, a span of unremarkable star systems, positioned too far from any viable trade route to merit colonization, or even sustained observation. But the signal was coming from there, and it was not sterile, it was dense. "How long has this been transmitting?" she asked. "Based on the signal decay profile and the lightspeed lag from the origin point, our analysts estimate it has been active for at least 40 standard years. Possibly longer." 40 years. Valith leaned back in her station chair and felt the cartilage along her spine compress. 40 years of structured, multi-layered, linguistically complex transmission pouring out of a region the Compact had written off as void. Either every survey mission for the past 3 centuries had failed catastrophically, or something had arrived in the Voreth exclusion after the last survey, something that had been broadcasting into the darkness for decades without anyone close enough to hear. Until now. "I want to go there," she said. Torek's chromatic scales shifted from neutral gray to the amber of alarm. "Director Sonkari, the Voreth exclusion is uncharted beyond the border markers. We would need fleet escort, compact authorization, provisioning for a deep range." "I want to go there," Valith repeated, and this time she was already composing the request to High Fleet Command on her secondary console. The authorization came faster than she expected. High Fleet Command assigned the expeditionary force within 6 rotations. The Calith Voss as the primary linguistics vessel, flanked by 2 Sentinel-class patrol cruisers and the heavy frigate Andrath Mail under Fleet Commander Rathais Gall. 14 ships in total, counting the sensor pickets and the logistics train. Enough force to handle a first contact scenario with an unknown civilization, which was the official designation the Compact had assigned. Enough force, also, to withdraw under fire if the scenario went wrong. Valith noted that the ratio of combat vessels to support vessels was higher than standard protocol recommended. Someone at Fleet Command was nervous. She spent the transit time, 11 days at maximum compression drive, running every analytical model she had against the captured signal fragments. She slept 4 hours out of every 20. She consumed her nutrient paste at her console without tasting it. She replayed the signal until the waveform patterns burned behind her eyelids when she closed them, and the 4-channel structure followed her into her shallow dreams. On the 3rd day, Gall summoned her to a briefing aboard the Andrath Mail via Hololink. He was a tall Sathrani, gray-skinned, heavy-jawed, with the deliberate movements of a species evolved for sustained effort rather than speed. His office was bare. No decoration, no personal effects, just the tactical displays and a single chair that looked like it had been sat in for decades. "Director," he said without preamble, "I have been reading the Compact survey reports for the Vorath exclusion, all 14 missions. The most recent was 9 years ago. I want you to explain something." He pulled up the survey data. 14 missions, 14 clean reports, no anomalous signals detected. Each of these missions carried passive sensor arrays capable of detecting structured electromagnetic emissions at ranges exceeding 1,000 light-years, Gall said. Several of them passed within 200 light-years of the bearing you have identified. If your signal has been transmitting for 40 years, at least 3 of these missions should have intercepted it. They did not. Either the signal was not present during those surveys, or it was present and was not recognized. Or it was present and was designed not to be recognized, Valith said. Gall's jaw tightened. "Explain." "The signal is structured, but its carrier frequency sits within a range associated with natural magnetar emissions. A standard survey scan would flag it as stellar background noise and filter it out automatically. Only a deep analysis pass with manual review would catch the information content beneath the carrier. None of the 14 surveys conducted deep analysis passes in that corridor. No, there was no reason to. The corridor was classified as sterile." Gall was silent for 7 seconds. Valith counted them. "So we are proceeding to meet a species that has been broadcasting for decades on a frequency specifically chosen to avoid detection by our standard instruments," he said. "A species that was present during at least 3 compact surveys and chose not to reveal itself. A species that is now choosing to reveal itself, to us, at a time of its own selection." "Yes, Director, in my experience, entities that choose when and how they are seen are entities that have spent considerable time studying how they are looked for." "I agree," Valith said. "That is one of the things that makes this signal so interesting." "Interesting is not the word my tactical staff is using." Valith understood his concern. She shared it. In the abstract, the part of her mind that had not been consumed by the signal's architecture could acknowledge that a species capable of hiding from compact sensors for decades was a species that demanded caution. But the other part of her mind, the part that had spent 31 years listening to the ways different species constructed meaning, was already listening past the tactical implications to the thing beneath them. A species that chose to hide was not necessarily a species that posed a threat. It was a species that understood the consequences of being found and had decided to control those consequences rather than be subject to them. That was not aggression. That was intelligence applied to self-preservation, and the fact that they were now choosing to be found, that the signal existed at all, suggested that the calculation had shifted. Something had changed in their assessment. Something had made them decide that the risk of contact was worth the cost of exposure. She wanted to know what that something was. The 4-channel structure was the key. She was sure of it now. No known species encoded information on 4 simultaneous channels. The Rithani, with their dual larynx anatomy, could manage two spoken word and subsonic emotional undertone. The Ilvari, the Compact's oldest member species and its most linguistically sophisticated, used three channels in their formal diplomatic language: light pulse, pheromone gradient, and geometric body positioning. 3 channels was the known ceiling. The theoretical maximum, according to the Compact's own cognitive models, was 3.5, the half being a marginal supplementary channel carrying contextual metadata, which the Vreth Collective demonstrated in their most complex formal registers. This signal used 4 full channels, each carrying distinct, non-redundant information. And the 4th channel, the one she could not identify, troubled her most. It was not tonal, not rhythmic, not mathematical. It carried information, she was certain, but the encoding principle was unlike anything in her database. When she isolated it and ran spectral analysis, the patterns shifted, not randomly, deliberately, as if the 4th channel were responding to her observation, adjusting its output in real time based on the analytical methods she was applying. She ran the analysis again using a different methodology. The 4th channel shifted again. Different output, same apparent responsiveness. Valith sat in her station chair and considered the implications of a signal that changed when you looked at it. On the 5th day of transit, Torek brought her a secondary analysis that nearly made her abandon the entire project. He had cross-referenced the signal's frequency profile against the Compact's archive of known natural phenomena and found a 91% match with a category of stellar radio emissions produced by magnetars, dead stars with magnetic fields strong enough to strip atoms at a distance. If the signal were natural, its origin would be unremarkable. A dying star screaming into the void, meaningless noise dressed in the coincidental clothing of pattern. Valith spent 6 hours proving it was not natural. The magnetar profile matched the signal's carrier frequency, yes, but the information content, the 4 channels, the structured intervals, the deliberate modulations sat on top of that carrier like text written on a page. The carrier itself might be natural, or it might have been chosen specifically because it mimicked a natural phenomenon. Either way, whoever was transmitting had selected a frequency that any casual observer would dismiss as stellar background noise. They were hiding in plain sight, broadcasting on a channel that sounded like a dead star. The implications settled into Valith's awareness like ice forming on a pipe. This was not a species that had stumbled into transmission. This was a species that understood how other species listened and had deliberately chosen a frequency designed to be overlooked. They were not careless. They were not naive. They knew what the Compact's survey probes were scanning for, and they had tuned their signal to fall beneath the threshold. They were intelligent, and they were careful, and they wanted to be found, but only by someone paying close enough attention. On the 7th day of transit, she made her first breakthrough. The mathematical channel resolved. It was a prime number sequence, but not a simple incremental one. The sequence was nested primes within primes, each layer referencing the structure of the layer above it. When she mapped the full architecture, the pattern extended into 3 dimensions, forming a lattice of interlocking mathematical relationships that was, Valith realized with a start, a proof, not of any particular theorem. The lattice itself was a demonstration of mathematical capability, a calling card that said, we understand structure, we understand abstraction, we understand the difference between pattern and noise. And it was also a key. When she applied the lattice's relational framework to the tonal channel, the tones resolved. They resolved into discrete phonemic units, syllables, or something analogous to syllables. The units were arranged in grammatical patterns that Valith's translation matrix could begin to parse. Subject-verb-object, but flexible, with word order shifting based on emphasis markers embedded in the pitch contour. Verb conjugation appeared to operate through tonal modification rather than suffixation. Modifiers preceded their targets. Questions were indicated not by a rising terminal pitch. The the universal marker she had found in 67 of the 93 known languages, but by a harmonic doubling of the verb. It was a language, a real, functional, natural language with vocabulary, grammar, syntax, and she was increasingly certain poetry. Valith stared at the translation matrix and felt something she had not felt since her first year at the Linguistic Institute on Koth Prime, when she had first heard the Ilvari diplomatic register and realized that language was not merely communication but architecture. Wonder. She ran the decoded phonemic structure through every typological model in the Compact's database, searching for parallels. There were none. The closest match, the Ilvari diplomatic register, shared a superficial similarity in that both systems used pitch as a grammatical marker. But the Ilvari system was binary, rising pitch for questions, falling pitch for declarations. This system used pitch as a continuous variable, modifying meaning along a spectrum rather than switching between two states. The difference was the difference between a light switch and a dimmer. The Ilvari had built an efficient communication tool. Whoever had built this language had built an instrument. On the 9th day, she decoded something that made her push back from her console and walk 3 circuits of the Caliph Voss's observation gallery before she trusted herself to continue. The tonal channel contained what appeared to be verb tenses markers that indicated when an action occurred relative to the speaker. Past, present, future standard across every language she had ever encountered. But this language had more than 3. It had at least 7. There were 2 forms of past tense. One for events the speaker had personally experienced, and one for events the speaker knew only through the accounts of others. There were 2 forms of future tense. One for events the speaker intended to bring about and one for events the speaker merely expected. And there were 3 forms of present tense, distinguished by what Valith could only describe as degrees of certainty, a present tense known, a present tense perceived, and a present tense felt. A species that had built the distinction between knowing and feeling into the conjugation of its verbs. Valith had spent 3 decades studying languages. She understood, in a way that few non-linguists ever could, that the structure of a language shaped the thinking of its speakers. A species with no future tense thought about time differently than a species with one. A species with 17 words for a color perceived that color differently than a species with 2. A species with 7 verb tenses, including separate conjugations for what they knew and what they felt, thought about reality itself, with a precision and a humility that made the Compact's most sophisticated philosophers look like children drawing with crayons. She worked through the night cycle and into the next day cycle without pause. The rhythmic channel, she discovered, was emotional modulation not unlike the Rithani subsonic layer, but far more granular. Where the Rithani distinguished between 8 emotional states through subsonic frequency, this signal's rhythmic channel carried dozens of distinct emotional markers: joy, grief, anger, tenderness, frustration, resolve, longing, satisfaction, embarrassment, defiance. Humor. That was the one that stopped her. She replayed the segment 14 times, checking her analysis against 3 independent decoding models. The rhythmic markers were unmistakable, a pattern associated with levity, with the deliberate subversion of expectation for the purpose of shared pleasure. The pattern appeared not in isolation, but embedded within longer utterances, modifying the semantic content of the tonal channel the way a solvent altered the properties of a compound. Whatever species had produced this signal, they embedded jokes into their communication at the foundational level, not as decoration, not as an optional register reserved for informal contexts, as architecture. The humor was structural. In 31 years, she had never encountered a species that built laughter into the bones of its language. On the 10th day, she made a discovery she almost did not report. The 4th channel, the unidentified one, had been running through her analysis subroutines continuously, and she had been treating it as background noise while she focused on the 3 channels she could decode. But on the 10th day, Her translation matrix flagged a correlation she had missed. The fourth channel's output was not random, and it was not merely responsive to her analysis. It was entrained to the other three channels in a specific mathematical relationship. When the tonal channel carried a noun, the fourth channel produced a corresponding output. When the rhythmic channel shifted emotional register, the fourth channel shifted with it. When the mathematical channel introduced a new structural element, the fourth channel generated a complementary pattern. It was not a separate channel at all. It was an integration layer, a channel that existed to bind the other three together into a unified whole. The tonal, rhythmic, and mathematical channels were the instruments. The fourth channel was the conductor. And the reason it seemed to change when she observed it was that she had been observing the channels separately. The fourth channel's output only made sense when all four were perceived simultaneously, as a single integrated stream. It was the channel that turned four separate kinds of information into one meaning. No species in the Compact's database integrated its communication channels at this level. The Ilvari's three channels operated independently, with meaning assembled by the listener after the fact. The Rithani's two channels ran in parallel, but were processed by different cognitive centers. This species had built a communication system where the channels were not parallel streams to be assembled, but interlocking components of a single architecture, bound together by a fourth channel that existed solely to ensure coherence. They did not speak in layers, they spoke in wholes, and the whole was greater than the sum of its parts in a way that Valeth's translation matrix was fundamentally incapable of rendering, because the matrix was built to process channels sequentially. To hear what these people actually said, she would need to hear all four channels at once and process them as a unity. She could not do that. Her cognitive architecture did not support it. No compact species' cognitive architecture supported it. These people thought in a way that the rest of the galaxy's sapient life literally could not perceive. Not because they were smarter, because they were integrated. Their minds did not separate analysis from emotion, from structure, from aesthetics. They experienced all four simultaneously as a single unified perception, and their language was built to carry that perception intact from one mind to another. Valeth stared at her console for a long time after that realization. Then she filed it carefully in the section of her report labeled Implications Requiring Further Study, and went back to work on the channels she could decode. But the knowledge sat in her awareness like a stone in a shoe, and it changed the way she listened. The Caliph Voss dropped out of compression drive on the 12th day, and the Voreth exclusion spread across the forward viewport like a dark canvas stitched with the faint light of distant, uncatalogued stars. Valeth was on the bridge. Torek was at her shoulder. Fleet Commander Rathais Gal stood at the tactical console aboard the Andrath Mail, his voice coming through the fleet channel with the clipped precision of a career officer who had spent 40 years learning to distrust the unknown. "Survey sensors active," Gal reported. "Scanning the signal origin point. Bearing 217 confirmed. Distance reducing at approach speed. We should have visual resolution in approximately." He stopped. Valeth watched the sensor display update. The signal origin was resolving and the data was wrong. Not wrong as in corrupted, not wrong as in ambiguous, wrong as in impossible. "Fleet Commander," she said. "I see it," Gal said. His voice had changed. The clipped precision was still there, but underneath it, something had tightened a compression in the lower registers that Valeth's trained ear identified as controlled alarm. "All ships, hold position. Sensor Division, confirm these readings. I want 3 independent confirmations before I accept this." The sensor pickets confirmed it in 11 seconds. 3 independent arrays. Same result. There was a ship at the signal origin point. 1 ship. A single vessel, holding position in the void with no apparent station-keeping thrust, no navigational beacon, no transponder code. But the readings did not make sense. The mass signature was enormous, substantially larger than the Andrath Mail, which was the largest vessel in the Compact's active fleet. The energy output was off the measurement scale, not because it exceeded the instrument's capacity, but because it was distributed in a pattern the sensors had no classification for. Power was not concentrated in drives and weapons systems, the way compact engineering distributed it. It was everywhere diffused through the hull in a web of energy pathways that suggested either catastrophic system failure or an engineering philosophy so alien that the Compact's instruments were reading it as noise. The hull composition registered as metallic, but the alloy was unknown, not similar to known alloys, not a variant, unknown. The spectrographic analysis returned a molecular structure that the Compact's material science database could not match to any natural or manufactured compound on file. And the thermal signature. The thermal signature was what had silenced Gaul. It was irregular hot spots and cold spots distributed across the hull in a dense, complex pattern that suggested internal compartmentalization on a scale the Compact had never engineered. Hundreds of distinct thermal zones, perhaps thousands, each one a separate environment, separately heated or cooled, separately pressurized if the faint atmospheric bleed the sensors were detecting was any indication. The ship was not a warship in any configuration Valith recognized. It was not a station. It was, in its thermal and energy profile, closer to a city. Fleet Commander, the Andrath Mail's senior sensor officer cut into the channel, her voice brittle with professional disbelief. I am reading organic compounds in the atmospheric bleed. Carbon chains, nitrogen, water vapor, and vegetation, chlorophyll analogs. That vessel has living plants aboard. Plants, Valith processed this. A ship that carried plants was not a military vessel on deployment. It was a vessel designed for permanence, for living, for growing things across the years. Confirmed, another sensor picket reported. We are also reading low-level gravitational distortion from the vessel's core, not drive-related. The pattern is consistent with a centrifugal gravity system, multiple rings, independently variable. They are generating artificial gravity in at least 6 distinct zones at different intensities. Different gravities for different areas. Valith filed that away. Recreation areas at 1 gravity, perhaps. Agricultural sections at another. Sleep quarters at a 3rd. A species that calibrated its environment not to a single standard but to the specific needs of specific activities. A species of engineers and optimizers, people who thought carefully about what they built and built it to serve multiple purposes. And the signal, the 4-channel signal that had drawn them across 400 light-years, was coming from it. Every channel, all 4, dense and active and alive. That is not a beacon, Valith said. That is someone talking. Talking to whom? Gull asked. Valith checked her translation matrix. The partially decoded tonal channel was still running through her system, and with the source now within direct sensor range, the signal resolution had sharpened dramatically. She could distinguish individual transmissions, now not one signal, but hundreds of them, overlapping, interleaving, a cacophony of voices all using the same 4-channel encoding, but with individual variations in tone, rhythm, vocabulary, and she noticed with a start the 4th channel. Each speaker's 4th channel was distinct, personal, like a fingerprint. Fleet Commander, Valith said carefully, I am detecting what appears to be internal communications from that vessel. Hundreds of individual speakers using the same linguistic framework with personal variations. This is a crewed ship. And they are talking to each other. A crewed ship of unknown origin, unknown composition, and unknown intent, Gall said, sitting in a region we have surveyed 14 times and found empty. How long has it been here? Based on the signal age profile, at least 37 standard years. Where was it during the surveys? The silence on the fleet channel was its own answer. Either the ship had arrived after the last survey, hiding in the dead zone for decades without detection, or it had been here all along, and 14 survey missions had passed within sensor range of a vessel the size of a small city and found nothing. The first option implied remarkable timing. The second implied something far more unsettling, a species that could hide from compact sensors at will and had chosen to reveal itself now, on its own terms, at a moment of its own selection. Neither option offered comfort, but Valith noticed something the tactical officers did not. The ship's signal output had not changed since their arrival. The hundreds of internal voice transmissions continued at the same volume, the same density, the same emotional register. If the crew of that vessel had detected the approach of 14 compact warships, and given their demonstrated ability to intercept compact communications, they almost certainly had not reacted with alarm. No spike in transmission urgency, no shift to encrypted channels, no reduction in civilian traffic that would suggest a military lockdown. They had detected the fleet, and they were not afraid. They were, if the emotional markers in their ambient signal were any indication, expectant. "Director Sonkari," Gall said, "I am going to attempt a standard first contact hail on the compact universal frequency. Compact protocol requires." "Wait," Valith said. She heard the breach of protocol in her own voice, a civilian linguist interrupting a fleet commander during an active operation, and did not care. "If I am right about the encoding structure, they will not recognize the compact universal frequency. Their communication architecture is entirely different from ours. A single-channel broadcast will read to them as a fragment, like hearing one instrument from an orchestra and trying to understand the symphony. Let me construct a response using their mathematical channel, the prime lattice. That is the one framework they have already demonstrated is universal." The pause on the fleet channel lasted 6 seconds. Valith could feel Gall weighing the calculus career officer, 40 years of protocol, 14 warships under his command, versus a civilian linguist asking him to set the compact playbook aside and speak mathematics to an unknown vessel in the void. "Do it," Gall said, "but weapon systems stay warm, all ships." Valith built the response in 40 minutes. She used the prime lattice as the carrier, the same three-dimensional structure the unknown ship was broadcasting, and embedded within it a simple mathematical statement. Not a greeting, not a name, not a claim or a warning. A proof. She sent them a mathematical theorem that was derivable from the principles their lattice demonstrated but which they had not explicitly stated. It was the linguistic equivalent of finishing someone's sentence, demonstrating not just that she had heard them, but that she understood the structure of what they were saying well enough to extend it. She transmitted it on the matched frequency and waited. Around her, the bridge crew of the Caliph Voss held their breath. The signal propagated across the void at light speed at this range, essentially instantaneous. On the tactical display, 14 compact ships held formation, weapons warm, sensor arrays locked on the unknown vessel. Valith watched the sensor feeds and tried not to calculate the odds that she had just made a catastrophic mistake. First contact mathematics was straightforward. If you hailed a species and they answered with weapons fire, you learned something valuable about them at a cost you had accepted in advance. If you hailed them and they answered with silence, you waited, and you tried again, and eventually you either established communication or concluded that communication was not desired. But if you hailed them in their own language, if you demonstrated that you had decoded their communication system and could operate within it, you had revealed something about yourself that could not be taken back. You had shown them your capability. You had shown them how you thought. And you had shown them that you considered them worth the effort. The response came in 9 seconds. The unknown ship's signal changed. Not all of it, the hundreds of individual voice transmissions continued without interruption, the crew going about their business. But a new channel opened. A fifth channel, layered on top of the original 4, directed specifically at the Caliph Voss, and this 5th channel was different from anything Valith had seen in 12 days of analysis. It was adaptive. The transmission started with the prime lattice, acknowledging her mathematical proof, extending it with 3 new theorems she had not considered, each one more elegant than the last. The 3rd theorem used a mathematical operation Valith had never encountered, and when she worked through its implications, she realized it was a compression algorithm, a way of encoding exponentially more information in the same bandwidth. They were not just responding to her mathematics. They were teaching her better mathematics, in real time, as a gift. Then the adaptive channel shifted. The tonal channel modulated, and for the first time, Valith heard something she could begin to parse as words. Not compact words, not any language she knew, but words shaped with deliberate, almost painful care, as if the speaker on the other end were reaching across a vast conceptual distance and bending their own language into a shape that might survive the crossing. And then the 4th channel activated at full intensity, and Valith finally understood what it was. Music. The 4th channel was music, not music as accompaniment or decoration, not music as a separate art form performed alongside speech. Music as language, melody and harmony and dissonance and resolution, carrying semantic content that the other 3 channels could not. Emotions too complex for the rhythmic channel's discrete markers, meanings too layered for the tonal channel's grammar. Relationships between ideas too fluid for the mathematical channel's rigid structure. The music channel carried what words could not, and it carried them the way water carried heat, diffused, pervasive, transforming everything it touched. The unknown species did not just speak with 4 channels. They sang. Every communication they produced was simultaneously a conversation, a mathematical framework, an emotional landscape, and a song. Valith's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the console and breathed through her spiracles until the trembling stopped. In 31 years of professional xenolinguistic work, she had decoded 93 languages. She had sat in sealed chambers breathing Vreth chemical gradients until her spiracles burned. She had spent 3 years learning to read the Morvathi click-pulse dialect, which required hearing in frequency ranges her species did not naturally possess. She had earned a reputation as the Compact's foremost living authority on alien communication. And she had never encountered anything like this. The sophistication was staggering, not the sophistication of technology or engineering, but of mind. Whatever species had built that city-sized ship and crewed it with hundreds of singing, joking, mathematically gifted individuals, they experienced reality through a communicative lens so rich and so layered that their basic casual speech exceeded the complexity of the Compact's most formal diplomatic language. What they produced without thinking, the Compact's best linguists could not produce at all. "They are better at this than I am," she told Torek. There was no shame in the admission, there was only awe. In the first hour of the adaptive channel's operation, it absorbed Valith's prime lattice and extended it into territories she had not known existed. In the second hour, it began incorporating elements of the Compact universal frequency, pulling the structure of Valith's own transmission apart, mapping it against its own linguistic framework, and reflecting it back with annotations. In the third hour, individual words began resolving. Nouns first. The unknown speaker was naming things, pointing, linguistically, at shared reference and offering labels. Ship, star, distance, light. You way. Each word arrived in all 4 channels simultaneously. The tonal channel provided the phonemic shape. The rhythmic channel tagged the emotional weight. The mathematical channel placed it in structural context. And the music channel, the 4th channel, gave it color, resonance, a feeling that extended beyond the word's literal meaning into territory Valith had no framework for. Their word for star, for instance. The tonal component was a 2-syllable unit with a falling pitch. The rhythmic component tagged it as neutral to positive. The mathematical component classified it as a category noun with specific positional properties. But the musical component added something that Valeth's translation matrix could only render as longing. Not longing for the star, longing associated with the star, as if the concept of a distant point of light carried, for this species, an inherent emotional resonance of yearning. They had built longing into the word for star. By the fifth hour, Valeth had a functional vocabulary of 400 words and the beginnings of a working grammar. The unknown speaker was fast, extraordinarily fast, adjusting their encoding in real time, building bridges between their 4-channel system and the Compact's single-channel broadcast with an agility that suggested either remarkable individual talent or a species-wide aptitude for linguistic adaptation. "What are they saying?" Torek asked. Valeth listened. The adaptive channel had shifted from vocabulary building to connected speech. The tonal channel carried words she could now parse. The rhythmic channel carried emotional weight, warmth, caution, the careful gentleness of someone reaching out to touch something they feared might break. The mathematical channel provided structural context, and the music channel wove through it all, carrying the meanings that fell between the words. "They are saying hello," Valeth said slowly, testing each word as she spoke it, knowing that her single-channel translation was reducing their 4-channel utterance to a fraction of its actual content. "But they are also saying much more than hello. I think they are saying that they have been waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For someone to answer." The 6th hour brought the breakthrough that changed everything. The adaptive channel transmitted a data package dense, structured, layered, too large for the translation matrix to process in real time. Valeth partitioned it into segments and began parsing. The first segment was a lexicon, thousands of words, cross-referenced with mathematical definitions, tonal examples, rhythmic markers, and musical phrases. The second segment was a grammar, rules of syntax, conjugation tables, modifier hierarchies, rules for the interaction between the 4 channels that governed how meaning was distributed across them. The third segment was a context guide, pragmatic rules for register, formality, humor, irony, emphasis. The fourth segment was a history. Valeth read the history and the cartilage along her spine went rigid. She read it again. She read it a third time, cross-referencing the tonal content against the rhythmic markers and the mathematical structure, looking for inconsistencies, for fabrication, for the tells that every linguist learned to spot in species that use deception as a communication strategy. She found none. The emotional channel was consistent throughout, the markers aligned with the content in a pattern that would be extraordinarily difficult to fake, because faking it would require controlling all 4 channels simultaneously, with a precision that even these remarkable communicators would struggle to sustain across a document of this length. The history was honest, every word. The species called themselves something that translated, imperfectly and with significant loss of musical content, as speakers of the whole voice, though Valeth suspected that the musical undertones in the name carried connotations closer to those who sing all the parts. They had been a spacefaring civilization for less than 3 of their centuries, young by Compact standards, strikingly young. The Compact's youngest member species, the Torathi, had been spacefaring for 11 centuries before joining. They had arrived in the Voreth exclusion 37 years ago. A single colony ship, carrying 4,000 individuals, launched from their home system on a journey that had taken their primitive compression drives nearly a decade to complete. They had come searching for a place far enough from their home system to start something new, something independent, something that could grow in its own direction without the gravitational pull of the civilization they had left behind. And they had detected the Compact's survey probes on 3 separate occasions during their decades in the exclusion. 3 times, the Compact's instruments had swept their region of space. 3 times, they had seen the probes on their own sensors. 3 times they had chosen not to respond. Not out of fear, not out of hostility, not out of incapacity. The history was explicit on this point, and the emotional channel that accompanied it carried a complex braid of regret and resolve and hope that made Valith's translation matrix stutter as it tried to render the mixture. They had chosen silence because they had been listening. For 37 years, they had been intercepting compact communications, diplomatic channels, commercial traffic, cultural broadcasts, military signals, academic transmissions, entertainment media, navigational beacons. They had been studying the 93 known languages, cataloging the political structures and cultural norms and historical grievances and military capabilities and trade relationships of every member species. They had been mapping who their neighbors were, what those neighbors valued, what they feared, how they treated strangers, how they resolved disputes, and whether they could be trusted. They had been, in essence, reading the Compact's diary. For 37 years, in 93 languages, they knew which member species harbored territorial grievances against their neighbors. They knew which trade routes were contested. They knew the voting blocks in the Compact Assembly, the fault lines in the military command structure, the unresolved border disputes that flared every few decades and were papered over with treaties that everyone knew were temporary. They knew more about the Compact than most Compact citizens did, and they had used that knowledge not to exploit or to threaten, but to prepare, to rehearse, to make sure that when the moment came, they would say the right thing in the right way to the right audience. And they had decided. The signal Valith had intercepted the 4-channel, multi-layered, deliberately complex transmission that had drawn this entire expeditionary force across the Vorath exclusion, had not been an accident or a careless leak. It had been an invitation, carefully constructed over years of preparation, precisely timed, transmitted on a frequency and with a complexity designed to attract exactly one kind of attention, the attention of someone who would try to understand it rather than fear it. The signal had been bait, Valith was the fish, and the hook had been baited with mathematics and music because whoever had designed it understood that a linguist would find it irresistible. Valith laughed. The sound escaped before she could stop it, a sharp bark of surprise and delight that made Torek flinch and drew startled looks from every officer on the bridge. She pressed her auditory membranes flat and forced herself to compose, but the laughter bubbled underneath. They had engineered their own first contact, not stumbled into it, not been discovered by accident. Engineered it the way a linguist would construct a controlled experiment with variables selected, conditions prepared, and the outcome shaped by design. The depth of the preparation staggered her. In the history segment, she found references to a dedicated team aboard the colony ship, a group of their own linguists who had spent the better part of 2 decades analyzing compact communications and building cross-reference databases between all 93 known languages and their own. They had identified recurring patterns, cultural assumptions, diplomatic triggers, and potential sources of misunderstanding. They had run simulations, thousands of them, modeling how different forms of first contact might unfold depending on who received the signal and what assumptions that receiver brought. They had even, Valith discovered with a jolt, identified her, not by name but by profile. Buried in the history was a reference to the Compact's central linguistic archive and the publications indexed there. One publication series, authored by a senior director whose work spanned all 93 cataloged species, had been flagged as the most likely profile for the individual who would decode the signal. The signal had been designed to attract that profile. The mathematical complexity was calibrated to be challenging, but not impossible for someone with extensive cross-species linguistic experience. The 4-channel structure was novel enough to demand expert attention, but structured enough to reward systematic analysis. They had not just designed a signal. They had designed a puzzle, tuned to the specific intellectual appetites of the person most likely to solve it. Valith did not know whether to be impressed or disturbed. She settled on both. "Director Sonkari," Gall's voice came through the fleet channel. "My tactical officer is reporting a shift in the unknown vessel's energy signature. Several additional thermal zones have activated on the hull, and there is a mass redistribution consistent with internal movement. I need to know if this is a threat posture." "It is not a threat," Valith said. "They are not preparing weapons. They are waking up. Additional sections of the ship are coming online. I believe crew members are moving to positions related to the contact. They are mobilizing their own people for this conversation. Fleet Commander, I have received a complete lexicon, a grammar, a pragmatic guide, and a partial history. They have been here for 37 years, observing the compact, learning our languages, waiting to make contact. And they designed that signal specifically to attract a linguist." "Why a linguist?" "Because they wanted the first conversation to happen through language, not through threat display. They wanted the first thing we did to be understanding them, not pointing weapons at them." Gall was silent for a long moment. "And the weapons?" "Their history includes references to conflict. They are not a pacifist species. But the way they encode discussions of violence is," Valith paused, searching for the right compact word. "Afflicted. The rhythmic channel applies markers I can only translate as deep structural grief. Their word for war carries musical overtones that resolve in a minor key. Fleet Commander, their language tells me that they are capable of fighting, and that they carry their fights the way one carries a fracture that never set properly." "That is a linguist's assessment, Director. Not a tactical one. With respect, Fleet Commander, language is the most honest data set you will find. A species can lie about its intentions. It cannot lie about the structure of its grammar. And the structure of this grammar tells me that these people chose to reveal themselves with a song, not a shot. And their capacity, if they decided not to sing." Valith considered the question honestly. The data was there, not just in the history's references to conflict, but in the signal architecture itself. The mathematical channel demonstrated a level of abstract reasoning that could be applied to weapons engineering as readily as to linguistics. The 4-channel encoding required cognitive parallel processing that most compact species could not achieve even with technological augmentation. And the fact that 4,000 individuals had successfully maintained a colony ship in deep isolation for 37 years, sustaining agriculture, engineering, social cohesion, and intellectual development without resupply or external contact, spoke to a species of formidable practical competence. "They are not weak," she said. "They are not harmless, but they are choosing to lead with their best quality rather than their most dangerous one. I would suggest we do the same." On the bridge, Torek scales had shifted from white to the pale blue of deep processing. His 4 eyes were fixed on the display, where the unknown ship schematic continued to resolve as more data arrived. "Director," he said quietly, "the data package includes a visual file, compressed, embedded in the history segment. Do you want me to decode it?" Valith nodded. The image rendered on the main display, and the bridge of the Caliph Voss fell completely silent. It showed the interior of the unknown ship, a large open compartment, a communal space, by the layout. The proportions were scaled for beings roughly 2/3 the height of an average compact species, with environmental lighting tuned to a warm yellow spectrum that suggested adaptation to a star slightly cooler than the compact standard. The surfaces were neither the polished composites of compact engineering nor the organic curves of Ilvari bioluminescent architecture. They were something between manufactured but warm, functional but personalized, with surfaces marked by wear and use, and the accumulated evidence of lives lived in close quarters for decades. And in the space, standing and sitting and moving with the unconscious ease of people in a familiar place, were the humans, They were smaller than Valeth had expected, soft-looking, no armored carapace, no chitinous plating, no bioluminescent organs, no visible natural weaponry, no claws, no fangs, no venomous spurs, no hardened striking surfaces. They had smooth skin in varying shades of brown and pink and amber and deep black. They had 2 eyes, forward-facing, with visible white sclera surrounding colored irises. They had flexible mouths with soft tissue that curved and stretched and compressed into an astonishing range of configurations. They wore coverings of woven fiber, not armor, not environmental suits, clothing, decorative, individualized clothing in a variety of colors and textures that served no protective function Valeth could identify. Some of the coverings bore patterns. Some bore what appeared to be text in their language. One individual wore a covering with a crude pictorial image that seemed, based on the rhythmic markers in the nearby audio, to be funny. Several of the humans had marked their own skin with permanent pigmented designs, geometric patterns, stylized images, text in their own script. Not medical, not functional, decorative. They had chosen to alter their own bodies for aesthetic reasons permanently, and the variety of designs suggested individual choice rather than cultural mandate. They touched each other constantly. That was the other thing Valeth noticed. A hand on a shoulder, an arm around a waist. 2 individuals sitting close enough that their bodies pressed together along one side, reading from the same data surface. A casual gesture, one human reaching out to brush a strand of fibrous growth from another's face that carried no apparent purpose beyond contact itself. The rhythmic markers in the ambient audio tagged these interactions with a cluster of emotional states that Valeth's matrix struggled to separate. Affection, comfort, belonging, trust, habit, presence. They touched each other the way her own species breathed unconsciously, constantly, as a baseline requirement for function. A tactile species. A species that needed physical proximity the way others needed light or heat. A species that had sealed 4,000 individuals inside a metal shell and flown them across 400 light-years of void, and had kept them sane by building a ship where they could touch. By every metric the Compact used to assess a species' threat profile, they were physically unremarkable. But that was not what silenced the bridge. In the center of the image, one of the humans was holding a smaller human. A child, Valeth realized, proportional head size, softer features, the unmistakable scaling of a juvenile form. The adult held the child against its chest with both arms wrapped around the small body in a closed circle, and the child's face was pressed into the curve of the adult's neck. The adult's eyes were half closed. The adult's mouth was curved upward, in a shape Valeth's translation matrix cross-referenced as the expression associated with the rhythmic markers for love, comfort, protection, presence. And the 4th channel, the music channel, was active in the image's audio layer. The adult was singing. A simple, quiet melody, 3 notes ascending, 2 descending, repeated in a slow loop. No words. Just sound. Sound shaped by a voice that trembled slightly on the higher register, carrying an emotional weight that lived entirely in the music and could not have been transmitted by any other channel. The rhythmic markers confirmed what the melody already said. The child was frightened. The adult was singing to the child because the child was frightened, and in this species' 4-channel communication system, music was the channel that carried comfort where words could not reach. Valeth sat in her station chair and did not move. Around her, the bridge crew of the Caliph Voss stood in the absolute, cartilage-locked stillness that her species adopted when confronting something that exceeded every existing category. Torek's chromatic scales had gone white. The navigational officer's membrane ears were folded flat. Even the ship's automated system seemed quieter, as if the Caliph Voss itself were holding its breath. The Compact had rules for first contact, elaborate centuries-refined protocols, assess the species' technological capability, evaluate their military posture, determine their political structure, classify them along the Compact's standardized rubric, potential ally, neutral party, active threat, or resource. Assign a trade value. File the report. Nowhere in those protocols was there a classification for a species that sang to its frightened children, using a language so complex that every lullaby was simultaneously a mathematical proof, an emotional landscape, a rhythmic meditation, and a song. Director Torek said, "What do we do?" Valith did not answer immediately. She was studying the other humans in the image. Some were watching the adult and child with soft expressions, eyes half-lidded, mouths curved, bodies oriented toward the pair with the subtle lean of empathic resonance. Others were engaged in their own activities. One was creating visual art on a flat surface, applying pigments with a thin implement in careful strokes, building an image of what appeared to be a landscape, green and blue, open sky, the suggestion of flowing water. A memory, perhaps. A place left behind 400 light-years ago. Another was laughing, head tilted back, mouth open wide, producing a sound that the rhythmic channel tagged as joy surprise connection. Laughing at something another human had said, a joke, embedded in the four-channel structure, that Valith could almost but not quite parse. She caught the mathematical component, a logical inversion, an expectation set up and then collapsed, and the tonal punchline, and the musical resolution that turned the collapse into pleasure. These were not warriors posturing for a threat display. These were not conquerors preparing a beachhead. These were people. People who built laughter into the architecture of their language and sang to their children and painted landscapes from memory and chose to spend 37 years learning to say hello before they said it. "Fleet Commander Gall," Valith said, and her voice was steady despite the fluid pressure behind her secondary eyelids. "I am going to respond to their adaptive channel. I am going to construct a message in their language, imperfect, certainly, but in their language, using their four-channel encoding. They extended the courtesy of learning hours. We should extend it in return. Director, I have 14 ships holding weapons warm on my order. What are you going to tell them?" Valith looked at the image one last time. The adult and the child, the painter, the laughing figure, the hundreds of voices talking and singing and living inside a ship they had sailed across 400 light-years because they wanted something new. "I am going to say hello," she said, "and I am going to mean it the way they do." Torek looked at her with all four eyes. "Director," he said very quietly so only she could hear, "can you actually construct a four-channel message? We do not have the vocal apparatus. We do not have the cognitive architecture. You said it yourself, their integration layer requires simultaneous perception across all four channels. We cannot do that." "No," Valith said, "we cannot. The message will be imperfect. It will be incomplete. It will be the equivalent of a child's first word malformed, mispronounced, carrying only a fraction of the meaning I intend. But they will understand what it represents. They will understand that we tried." "How do you know?" "Because they built humor into their grammar and grief into their word for war, and longing into their word for star. A species that experiences language with that degree of emotional granularity will hear the intent behind the attempt. They will hear that we are reaching." On the tactical display, she watched the compact fleet's weapon signatures, 14 vessels, each one carrying enough ordnance to sterilize a continent. She watched the unknown ship's energy profile diffuse, distributed, alive with the thermal signatures of 4,000 individuals going about their lives inside a vessel they had built to carry everything they were across the dark. And she thought about what the humans had done and what it meant. They had sat in the void for 37 years. They had watched the compacts survey probes pass overhead. They had listened to 93 languages and studied the civilizations that spoke them. And they had concluded after decades of observation, after thousands of simulations, after what must have been years of internal debate, that the risk was worth it. That the galaxy they had been watching deserved a greeting. That the species out here, with their single-channel languages and their weapons-worn fleets and their centuries of accumulated mistrust, were worth talking to. That was the part that humbled her, not their intelligence, not their linguistic sophistication, their faith. They had looked at the Compact, at its wars, its politics, its territorial disputes, its long history of species meeting each other and defaulting to suspicion, and they had decided to say hello anyway. She built the message with the care of a jeweler setting stones, the mathematical channel first extending the prime lattice one step further, adding a theorem that referenced their three gifts, demonstrating that she had not merely received them but understood them. The tonal channel next 12 words, imperfect, probably mispronounced terribly by any human standard but recognizable. We hear you. We are here. We are glad. The rhythmic channel she set to the emotional markers for curiosity, respect, welcome, matching as closely as she could the warmth she had detected in their adaptive transmission. The music channel was the hardest. Valith was not a musician. Her species did not sing. Their auditory membranes were optimized for frequency discrimination, not production. But she had spent 12 days and 7 hours inside this signal's architecture, and she understood, at least intellectually, what the music channel was supposed to carry. So she constructed a simple melodic line, 3 notes ascending, based on the harmonic structure she had extracted from the lullaby. It carried no specific semantic content. It was, as nearly as she could manage it, the musical equivalent of an open hand extended across the dark. She transmitted. The response came in 4 seconds. 4 seconds. Valith had spent 40 minutes constructing her message. They had processed it, evaluated it, composed a reply, and transmitted all in the time it took her secondary eyelids to blink twice. The unknown ship's signal transformed. Not alarm, not the sharp, urgent, contracting patterns Valith's experience associated with threat response. Something entirely different. The hundreds of individual voice transmissions that had been running in the background suddenly shifted, a wave of change propagating through the ship's internal communications. Voices pausing, redirecting, converging. The emotional channels across the entire vessel flared with a single shared feeling that cascaded through the rhythmic markers like a harmonic overtone. Joy, relief, hope, connection, wonder. They were happy. 4,000 humans aboard a ship in the dark between uncatalogued stars, a ship they had lived in for 37 years, waiting, listening, preparing, were collectively, genuinely happy because someone had spoken to them in their own language, because someone had tried, because the 3 ascending notes of a badly constructed melody, transmitted by an alien linguist who could not sing, had landed. Valith's translation matrix chimed, a new transmission on the adaptive channel, simpler than the data package, more immediate, a single voice carrying all 4 channels with the practiced ease of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for years. The mathematical channel provided context. This was an individual of authority, a leader. The tonal channel resolved into words. You learned fast, faster than we expected. We have been practicing your languages too, all 93 of them, but we were not sure we would get the pronunciation right. We did not want to offend anyone. Please know that every mistake we make is honest. The rhythmic channel carried warmth, humility, hope. And the music channel sang a melody Valith did not recognize but understood immediately. It was gratitude, pure, unadorned gratitude, shaped into sound, offered freely to a stranger who had taken the time to listen. Valith felt her secondary eyelids close involuntarily. When she opened them, her vision was blurred. Her ocular glands were producing fluid, a physiological response her species typically reserved for injury or extreme emotional overload. She blinked the fluid away and composed herself. Behind the leader's voice, the ship's internal communications had shifted. The hundreds of individual voices were still active, but their emotional channels had synchronized. Valith could hear it spreading through the vessel like a harmonic resonance, the news passing from section to section, compartment to compartment, a ripple of shared feeling that unified 4,000 separate voices into a single emotional chord. Someone answered. They answered in our language. It worked. It worked. One transmission stood out from the collective. A single voice, smaller than the others, carrying the unmistakable tonal markers of a juvenile, a child's voice, piping and clear, asking a question in the human's four-channel language. Valith's translation matrix rendered it imperfectly, but the core meaning was clear. Are they nice? The adult who responded, not the leader, someone else, someone close to the child, answered with a single word carried on all four channels. The tonal component said yes. The rhythmic component carried gentle certainty. The mathematical component framed it as a provisional assessment subject to revision. And the musical component carried a melody that resolved in a major key, open-ended, a song that had not yet found its final note, because the story it described was still being written. Yes, but we are still learning. Fleet Commander Gall, she said. I heard it, Gall said, and his voice had changed. The career officer's clipped precision was still there, it would always be there, structural as bone, but underneath it, something had given way. A rigidity that had been holding since the first sensor return released. Your assessment, she asked. There was a pause. On the tactical display, 14 compact warships held formation around a single vessel that had spent 37 years learning how to say hello. Stand down weapons, Gall said quietly. All ships, stand down weapons and open all communication channels. There was a pause on the fleet-wide channel. Valith heard the murmur of it, officers on 14 different bridges processing the order, the career instinct to question, the protocol that demanded weapons stay warm until a threat assessment was filed and reviewed and signed by 3 levels of command. Gall heard it too. That was not a suggestion, he said. These people spent 37 years learning how to talk to us. The least we can do is listen without holding a gun. Stand down weapons. All ships, now. The tactical display updated. One by one, the weapons' signatures across the fleet flickered and dimmed. 14 ships, disarming, on the order of a career officer, who had spent 4 decades training to keep them armed. We are going to talk to these people. On the bridge of the Caliph Vas, Valith Sonkari pulled up a blank file in her translation matrix and began a new entry. Species 94. Language classification. 4-channel integrated encoding tonal, rhythmic, mathematical, musical, capable of humor, grief, gratitude, irony, laughter, and song. Structural emotional encoding embedded at the grammatical level. Musical channel carries semantic content beyond the capacity of verbal language. Native species designation, humans. She typed the first line of her formal contact report, the document that would go to the Compact's central archive, and define this species for every civilization that encountered them after. Species demonstrates linguistic complexity exceeding all current Compact benchmarks across every measured dimension. Recommend immediate upgrade from survey classification to full diplomatic engagement. Priority, maximum. She paused, deleted the last 4 words, added something else. Something that no contact report in the Compact's 3,000-year history had ever said, because no contact had ever required it. They sang to us, we should listen. She stared at the words on her screen. 5 words. In the Compact's single-channel language, 5 flat, declarative, unremarkable words. If they had been spoken in the human's 4-channel system, they would have carried the tonal content of a statement, the rhythmic weight of awe, the mathematical precision of a recommendation backed by data, and a musical line that she was certain now would have resolved in that open, unfinished major key the humans used for things that were still becoming. 5 words, and all the meaning that would not fit between them. The human leader's transmission continued to arrive. Each new sentence expanded the vocabulary, deepened the grammar, widened the bridge between two species separated by 400 light-years and 93 languages, and a silence that had lasted 37 years and was now, finally, filled. The humans talked the way they built in layers, each one reinforcing the others, each one carrying part of the weight so that no single channel bore it all. Their language was not a tool they picked up and put down. It was a space they inhabited, a structure they lived inside. And now, with the careful deliberation of people who understood what first impressions cost, they were opening the door. On the Andrath mail, Gall had quietly ordered his communications officer to begin recording everything. Not just the adaptive channel transmissions, not just the decoded vocabulary and grammar and history, but the raw signal, all 4 channels, unprocessed, unfiltered, preserved in their original integrated form. When Valith asked why, he said something that surprised her. "Because someday," he said, "the Compact will develop the capability to hear all 4 channels at once, the way they were meant to be heard. And when that day comes, I want us to have a record of what they actually said to us, not just what we were able to understand." It was the most linguistically sophisticated thing Valith had ever heard a fleet commander say. She did not tell him that. She simply nodded and returned to her work, and on the raw signal recording, the humans sang on. Outside the viewport, the human ship hung in the void, scarred, weathered, its hull scored by decades of micrometeorite impact, its thermal signature that complex patchwork of thousands of compartments, thousands of lives. On the Compact's instruments it read as an anomaly, an object that defied classification, that fit no existing category. But Valith was a linguist, and she knew that the failure to classify was not the object's shortcoming. It was the taxonomy's. Gall's voice came through the fleet channel one final time, and when it did, the career officer sounded like a man who had found something he had not known he was looking for. "Log it as first contact, designation Sol 3. Classification, Priority 1. Note for the record that initial contact was established through linguistic exchange, not military posture. Note that the contacted species demonstrated patience, deliberate vulnerability, and a communicative capacity that exceeds current Compact models." He paused. Then he added something that no fleet commander in the Compact's history had ever appended to a first contact log. "Note that they sang, note that they waited, and note that when they finally spoke, every word was a gift." Valith did not hear the log entry. She was deep in the adaptive channel, trading words, building the bridge one syllable at a time, feeling the architecture of a new language taking shape around her like the scaffolding of a cathedral she would spend the rest of her career exploring and never reach the roof of. The work was enormous. It would take years, decades. It would require disciplines that did not yet exist. She did not mind. The work itself was the reward, each new word decoded, each grammatical rule mapped, each musical phrase understood was a small, private moment of contact with a species that had spent decades preparing for exactly this exchange. And somewhere on the other side of that exchange, she knew, the humans' own linguists were doing the same work in reverse, decoding the Compact's languages, mapping the Compact's communication structures, translating the single-channel flatness of the Compact's formal register into something their 4-channel minds could process. They were reaching toward her at the same time she was reaching toward them, and the space between was narrowing with every word. She had been waiting for this, she realized, not consciously, not knowingly. But somewhere in the 31 years of systematic cataloging, of filing and indexing and reducing the miraculous to the documented, she had been waiting for a language that refused to fit in the archive. A language that required her not to classify it, but to live inside it. She had spent 31 years cataloging the known, 93 languages filed and indexed and understood. This was the 94th, and it was not a language she would catalog. It was a language she would learn. It would take the rest of her career. It might take the rest of her life. And it would not be enough. because the 4 channels carried more meaning per utterance than any single mind could fully absorb, and every conversation would contain layers she missed, references she could not parse, musical undertones she could not hear. It did not matter. The reaching was the point. The attempt was the meaning. The humans had taught her that in the first 12 words they spoke to her, every mistake is honest, and she would carry it forward into every imperfect, halting, beautiful exchange that followed. The stars of the Vorath exclusion burned in the viewport, ancient and indifferent. The ship sang on, and in the space between 2 signals, in the gap where one species reached and another reached back, where a melody constructed by someone who could not sing met a silence held for 37 years by people who could, something was being built. Not a treaty, not a trade route, not a strategic alliance or a threat assessment or a classified file in the Compact's archive. A conversation. Already it was growing. The adaptive channel had branched into multiple threads, Valeth trading linguistic structure with the human's lead linguist on one thread, while on another, Torek was receiving what appeared to be a catalog of the human's visual art, transmitted with musical annotations that explained what each piece meant to the species that had created it. On a third thread, one of the Andrath male sensor officers had begun exchanging navigational data, the 2 species mapping their understanding of the local star field against each other and finding, to mutual delight, that they had named the same stars and disagreed about their significance. The human's word for the Vorath exclusion central star translated as the Quiet One. The Compact's designation was Sigma Vorath 7. Neither name was wrong. Both names were true. The conversation was growing the way a fire grows, not by being pushed but by finding fuel, by spreading from point to point, contact to contact, until the space between the 2 species was no longer a void but a web, still fragile, still imperfect, still full of gaps where meaning fell through and had to be retrieved and repaired, but growing. The first real conversation between the known and the unknown, happening not on a battlefield, not in a council chamber, not through the sterile filters of protocol, but in the imperfect, halting, singing space where language lives when it is being born. Gall was right. It was the linguist who found them. But it was the humans who had made sure she could. The invitation arrived on the 14th hour of sustained communication, not through the adaptive channel, through a new one, a 6th channel, narrowband, directed solely at Valeth's personal console with a targeting precision that should have been impossible at this range. The human's lead linguist who had identified herself, through a complex 4-channel phrase that Valeth's matrix rendered imperfectly as keeper of the bridge between, transmitted a single structured request. Come aboard. 2 words, 4 channels. The tonal component was a statement, not a question. The rhythmic component carried anticipation layered with deliberate vulnerability, the emotional signature of someone opening a door they could not close again. The mathematical component framed it as an equivalence. You have entered our language, now enter our space. And the musical component resolved in that open, major key Valeth had come to recognize as the human's marker for things that were still becoming. Gall refused, then he reconsidered, then he refused again. Then Valeth explained, with the patience of a linguist who had spent 31 years translating the untranslatable, that refusing an invitation from a species that had spent 37 years preparing to issue, it would communicate something the Compact could not afford to say. What would it communicate? Gall asked. That we are afraid of what we do not understand, and that fear matters more to us than knowledge. Gall was quiet for 11 seconds. She counted them. 1 shuttle, minimal crew, you, your junior analyst, and a 4-person security detail, weapons holstered, and you stay on an open channel to this ship at all times. Agreed. The shuttle crossed the gap between the Caliph Voss and the human vessel in 9 minutes. Valith spent those 9 minutes watching the hull grow in the viewport until it filled the entire field of view, a wall of scarred, weathered metal that stretched in every direction, pocked with micrometeorite impacts and streaked with the residue of decades of hard vacuum exposure. Up close, the hull was not smooth. It was layered plate over plate, weld over weld, repair over repair. A ship that had been maintained not by replacing worn components with new ones but by reinforcing them, building over them, adding strength where time had taken it. The hull was a geological record, decades of survival written in metal. A bay opened in the hull's flank, not a mechanical iris or a sliding panel, but a section of hull that folded outward on articulated joints, revealing a pressurized interior lit in warm amber. The shuttle's pilot guided them in. The bay sealed behind them. Atmosphere hissed into the space, and Valith's environmental sensors reported a breathable nitrogen-oxygen mix at a pressure and temperature comfortable for most compact species. They had calibrated their airlock for alien physiology. Another preparation, another detail planned years in advance. The inner door opened, and the humans were there. She had seen them in the transmitted image. She had studied their physical characteristics, cataloged their soft skin and forward-facing eyes and flexible mouths. She had noted their lack of natural armor, their decorative clothing, their constant touching. None of it had prepared her for the experience of standing in the same atmosphere as them. 3 humans waited on the other side of the airlock. 2 stood slightly behind the third, a formation Valith recognized from a dozen species greeting protocols as an honor arrangement, the flanking individuals signaling deference to the one in front. The lead human was shorter than Valith by a full head. Brown skin, dark eyes, gray-streaked hair pulled back from a face lined with the evidence of decades. Clothing in deep blue, simple, without insignia or rank markings. Hands visible, empty, held slightly away from the body in a posture that was either cultural greeting or deliberate demonstration that they carried no weapons. Possibly both. But none of that was what struck Valith first. What struck her first was that all 4 channels were active, not through a transmission array, not through a signal compressed into a carrier wave. The human in front of her was producing all 4 channels simultaneously, in real time from her own body. The tonal channel came from the human's mouth. The sounds were richer in person, deeper, more textured, carrying harmonics that the signal's compression had stripped away. The rhythmic channel came from the human's body, the cadence of breathing, the micro-movements of weight shifting from one foot to the other, the pulse visible in the throat. The mathematical channel came from the structure of the words themselves, each utterance placed with the precision of a proof being constructed in real time. And the musical channel, the 4th channel, in the transmitted signal it had been extraordinary. In person, standing 2 meters from a human being who was producing it live, it was something else entirely. The human was not singing, not in the way Valith had assumed from the signal analysis. The music was not a separate vocalization layered on top of speech. It was speech. The tonal qualities of the human voice, the rise and fall of pitch within each syllable, the timbre shifts between words, the micro-variations in resonance that changed with each breath, were the music. Every word the human spoke was simultaneously a note. Every sentence was a phrase. Every pause was a rest. The music was not added to the language. The music was the language heard whole. Valith's translation matrix could not process it. The matrix was designed to separate channels, decode them individually, and reassemble meaning from the components. But there were no components. There was only the whole, a single integrated stream of meaning that carried semantic content and emotional weight and mathematical structure and musical beauty in every syllable, indivisible. The way light carried all its wavelengths at once. The human spoke. Valith heard words. She heard tone, rhythm, structure, melody. She heard all 4 channels, and for the first time she understood what the 4th channel actually was. It was not music. That had been her error, an error of translation, of forcing an alien phenomenon into a familiar category. What the fourth channel carried was not melody in any formal sense. It was presence, the irreducible reality of one conscious mind reaching toward another through the medium of shaped air. The fourth channel was the part of communication that could not be decomposed into phonemes or grammar or emotional markers or mathematical structures, because it was not information at all. It was the fact of the speaker, the specific, unrepeatable, singular fact of this particular mind, choosing to share itself with another. Every human utterance carried the speaker's identity as an intrinsic component of the message, not as metadata, not as a signature appended to the content, as the content itself. The fourth channel was the channel that said, I am here, I am real, I am the one speaking to you, and no one else in the universe could speak these words in exactly this way because no one else is me. That was why each speaker's fourth channel was unique. That was why it changed when observed in isolation, because isolating it destroyed it, the way isolating a color from a painting destroyed the painting. The fourth channel existed only in relationship. It was the channel of self, and self only existed in the act of reaching toward another. The Compact's languages carried information. The Ilvari's three-channel system carried information, emotion, and structure. The human's four-channel system carried information, emotion, structure, and self. They did not just communicate, they gave themselves away with every word. Valith stood in the airlock of a human colony ship 400 light-years from the Compact border, and she understood. The 37 years of silence, the careful hiding, the decades of preparation, the thousands of simulations, the obsessive study of 93 alien languages. It was not caution, though caution was part of it. It was not strategy, though strategy was part of it. It was that every time a human spoke, they handed a piece of themselves to the listener. Their language made them constitutionally incapable of communicating without vulnerability. Every word was an act of trust. Every sentence was an offering. And they had waited 37 years to make that offering because they needed to be sure, absolutely, rigorously, exhaustively sure that the civilizations they spoke to would not use that vulnerability against them. They had been afraid, not of the Compact's weapons, not of its military capability or its political machinations. They had been afraid that they would speak, and that the galaxy would hear only noise. The human leader, the keeper of the bridge between, finished her greeting. Her hands were still extended, palms up, fingers open. The posture was universal in intent if not in form. Here I am unarmed. I am choosing to let you see me. Behind her, the two flanking humans were watching Valith with expressions she could now read without her translation matrix. Eyes wide, mouths slightly parted, bodies leaning forward with the subtle inclination of people straining toward something they wanted. The rhythmic channel in their breathing carried the emotional markers for hope, so intense it bordered on pain. They wanted this to work. They wanted it the way a species that built longing into the word for star wanted things wholly, structurally, with their entire being organized around the wanting. Valith did something she had never done in 31 years of professional xenolinguistic work. She set her translation matrix to passive record, took the analytical framework she had spent her career building, and set it aside. She stopped listening as a linguist. She started listening as a person. The human spoke again. Valith did not parse the channels. She did not separate the tonal from the rhythmic, from the mathematical from the fourth. She listened to all of it at once, the way it was meant to be heard, and she let the meaning arrive whole. She did not understand all of it. She understood perhaps a third, the words she had decoded, the emotional markers she had mapped, the mathematical structures she could follow. The rest was music she could not yet hear, meaning she could not yet reach, a depth she would spend years learning to perceive. But the third she understood was enough. It was more than enough. The human was saying, "We built this ship to carry our children across the dark. We built it to carry our songs and our paintings and our laughter and our grief. We built it to carry everything we are, because we did not know what we would need when we arrived. So we brought all of it. And now we are here and you are here, and we would like to show you what we carried. Would you like to see? Valith felt the fluid pressure behind her secondary eyelids and did not blink it away. She let it come. On the open channel, she heard the bridge crew of the Caliph Voss in absolute silence. She heard Gaul's breathing, steady and controlled, the breathing of a man listening to something he would remember for the rest of his life. She answered in their language, imperfect, halting, a child's first word, malformed and mispronounced, carrying only a fraction of what she meant. But she used all 4 channels, the tonal shapes she had learned, the rhythmic markers she had mapped, the mathematical framework she had decoded, and for the 4th channel, the only thing she had to offer, herself. The specific, unrepeatable fact of Valith Sonkari standing in an airlock reaching. Yes, she said, show me everything. The human's face changed. The mouth curved. The eyes brightened. The entire body shifted, shoulders dropping, hands rising, head tilting in that distinctive human gesture that Valith now understood was not a single expression but a chord, a 4-channel emotional utterance produced by the body rather than the voice. The human smiled. And behind her, spreading through the ship in a wave that Valith could track on her passive recorder, compartment to compartment, deck to deck, 4,000 voices picking up the signal and passing it on the colony ship's internal communications surged. Not with alarm, not with orders, with singing, real singing. Voices raised together in a melody that used all 4 channels at full intensity, carrying a single unified meaning that every speaker shared. The word for it in their language was untranslatable. Valith's matrix offered 11 partial renderings, each one capturing a facet: welcome, joy, relief, gratitude, celebration, homecoming, beginning, hope, connection, completion, song. None of them were right, all of them were true. Valith walked through the airlock, and the singing wrapped around her, and the door to the void closed behind her, and the door to everything else opened. On the bridge of the Andrath Mail, Fleet Commander Rathais Gaul listened to 4,000 humans singing, and he amended his log entry one final time. The career officer's handwriting was precise, each character formed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that this document would be read for centuries. He wrote, Addendum to First Contact Report, Designation Sol 3. The contacted species' primary mode of engagement is not territorial, military, or economic. It is communicative. Their deepest technology is not their ship or their drives or their stealth capability. It is their language. They have weaponized nothing. They have offered everything. In 37 years of silence, they did not build defenses. They built a vocabulary. He paused, set down his stylus, picked it up again. Recommend the compact begin learning to sing. Across the void, in the warm amber light of a ship that had crossed 400 light years carrying 4,000 people, and their songs and their paintings and their laughter and their grief and their longing and their love, Valith Sonkari sat in a room full of humans and listened to a species that had spent 37 years learning to say hello, and had meant every syllable, and had waited and had hoped, and had finally been heard. The stars burned on, ancient and indifferent. But in the small, warm space between 2 species in the room, where a linguist who could not sing sat with a people who could not stop, the universe was, for the first time in a very long while, paying attention.